They say every family has its secrets, but some secrets are not simply hidden. They are buried in the marrow, etched into faces, carved into bloodlines like a curse that cannot be escaped. Tonight, you will hear a story that few dare to tell, a story of a bride whose wedding day was not a celebration, but a spectacle of shame. She was not chosen, she was claimed, and the man waiting for her at the altar was not a stranger, not even a distant cousin, but her own brother. Imagine the scene. A small wooden church set against the Appalachian hills, the paint peeling from its walls, the air heavy with summer heat and whispers that never quite rose to words. The guests were family, but not in the way most weddings are filled with relatives. No outsiders had been invited. No outsiders were ever invited. This was a union meant to bind a family tighter into itself, to seal the cracks through which truth might otherwise escape. The bride was 13. Her white dress had been sewn from old curtains, stitched together by hands that shook with quiet resignation. She looked older than her years, not because of wisdom or strength, but because of a burden pressed into her before she could ever consent to carry it. Her face bore the unmistakable signs of generations that had turned inward, eyes too close, jaw too soft, skin pale as if the blood itself resisted circulation. Her brother, the groom, stood proud in the shadows, not proud of love, but proud of power. The town knew, they always knew. They saw the children born from these unions and recognized in their faces the cruel arithmetic of incest, the slanted stares, the twisted teeth, the strange gait of bodies formed by bloodlines that had folded back upon themselves. But in towns like these, silence was survival. To speak against the family was to mark yourself as prey. And so the ceremony began, a priest mumbling words that saying sounded more like a curse than a blessing, and the ring, if you could call it that, slipped onto her trembling hand. What was witnessed that day was not a marriage, but a ritual of control, a tightening of chains disguised as vows. This was not a wedding for joy, or for hope, or for the birth of something new. This was a wedding of shame. The girl's name has been scrubbed from most records, but the whispers that survived speak of her as if she were a ghost already on her wedding day. They called her the Pale Bride, a child who carried the look of someone twice her age, her eyes dark pools of dread. No diary, no testimony survives from her own lips. What remains are the fragments, second-hand accounts, clippings in forgotten newspapers, the murmured recollections of neighbors who watched from a distance, yet never intervened. Her family was known for keeping to themselves. The homestead sat deep in the hills, cut off by winding dirt roads that outsiders rarely traveled. To visit was to enter a world apart, where family meant everything, and nothing else mattered. Blood was treated not as a bond of love, but as currency, traded and recycled until it became thin, fragile, and poisoned. The old women would warn their children never to wander too close to that house, yet even warnings could not stop curiosity. Those who saw the girl before the ceremony remembered her nervous hands, always twisting at her dress, her eyes darting toward the door as though some part of her hoped for rescue. But no one came. Rescue was not the custom. Suffering was inheritance, and on that day she was given no choice but to walk down that aisle and into a future already decided by the sins of those before her. The brother who stood as groom had a different presence altogether. Accounts describe him as broad-shouldered, with a face that seemed caught halfway between boyhood and something monstrous. He wore no suit, only a patched shirt and trousers, yet he carried himself with an authority that made others bow their heads. He was the heir of a system older than he was, a cycle that fed on obedience, silence, and fear. For him, the wedding was not shame, it was triumph. When the vows were spoken, no tears fell. The guests sat in stillness, their faces blank, as if carved from the same stone. Generations had sat in those pews before, watching ceremonies just like this one, knowing what would come of them. Children born not out of love but necessity, children who would carry the deformities and curses forward into another generation. That was the true legacy of the Pale Bride's wedding. Not a single day of happiness, but the endless weight of a family determined to collapse inward until there was nothing left but ruin. What followed the wedding was not a honeymoon, but a sentence. The girl was led from the church back to the homestead where she had been raised, only now as a wife instead of a daughter. The boundaries of her world did not expand with marriage. They shrank, tightening around her like a noose. The same walls that had sheltered her childhood became the cage of her adulthood, and the man she once called brother became her master. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones of what they saw in the months after. A child bride walking to the well with hollow eyes, her body thinning from work and neglect. Some swore she never smiled again after that day. Others claimed they would hear screams carried across the hills on nights when the wind was sharp enough. Whether those screams belonged to her or to the children who came later, no one could say for sure. Silence was safer. Silence kept the peace. The family had long perfected the art of secrecy. Children who were born with obvious deformities were hidden away, sometimes never registered with the county. Stories circulated of infants who lived only days, their tiny bodies quietly buried in the earth behind the house. When one of these children survived long enough to be seen in public, people whispered of crossed eyes, twisted limbs, or strange sunken features that told of a bloodline stretched beyond breaking. Each child became a living testimony to the shame of the union that had created them. And yet, despite the pain, despite the shame, the cycle continued. That is the nature of such families. What begins as desperation becomes tradition, and tradition hardens into law. The pale bride's suffering was not unique, only another thread in a pattern that had repeated for generations. She was both victim and vessel, chosen not for who she was, but for what she could bear. Some who lived nearby would later admit that they avoided the etched family's land entirely. They feared what might be seen if they looked too closely, as though even witnessing such misery might curse their own homes. For those who did pass through, one memory remained consistent. The sound of children's laughter that wasn't quite laughter at all, sharp and broken, echoing from the hills like something not entirely human. This was the world the pale bride entered, a world from which there was no escape, only endurance, until endurance itself gave way to tragedy. The tragedy of her life was not sudden. It unfolded slowly like rot creeping through the beams of a house, unseen until collapse became inevitable. She bore children young, too young for her body to endure. The first was frail, born underweight, his skin tinted grey, his cries thin and wavering. The neighbors said he did not live past his first winter. No burial marker was ever raised. He simply vanished into the frozen ground behind the house, another unspoken shame in a family already drowning in it. The second child lived longer, though his survival was marked by suffering. His eyes never aligned, one drifting toward the wall while the other searched in vain for his mother's face. He struggled to walk, each step a battle against the shape his blood had given him. Yet for the bride, now a mother, his existence was both torment and proof of what had been done to her, proof of the cycle she had been forced to continue. To hold him was to feel the weight of generations pressing down on her arms. There were whispers that she began to wither not only from childbirth but from despair. Some claimed she would sit for hours on the porch, staring out at the hills as if the trees might open and reveal a path to freedom. Others said she spoke less and less, her voice growing thin until it seemed she had no words left to give. She had become a relic in her own home, a girl stolen from herself before she had even reached womanhood. The brother who was now her husband felt none of her sorrow. His pride was in strength, in continuation, in proving the bloodline would not break no matter how twisted it became. He was seen often in town, bartering, drinking, laughing with the bravado of a man who knew no shame. Behind closed doors, however, his shadow loomed over the pale bride. The bruises on her arms told stories her lips never could. For the community, it was easier to look away. Easier to pretend the house on the hill was simply strange rather than cursed. But deep down, they all knew. The wedding had not only bound one girl to her brother, it had chained the entire family to a legacy of ruin. and each child born of that union carried the proof in their very bones. Time has a way of turning horror into routine. The pale bride aged quickly, her youth stolen by childbirth and grief, her body worn down long before she reached 20. By then, the signs of collapse were everywhere. Children were born weaker, some not surviving beyond the first breath. The ones who did survive bore the unmistakable marks: sunken jaws, sloping foreheads, eyes that struggled to focus. Each one was a reminder that the bloodline was folding further in upon itself, like a snake devouring its own tail. And yet, there was no interruption, no intervention. Families like hers learned to survive in shadows, guarded by silence and denial. To outsiders, they were whispers, half-remembered rumors told in grocery stores and gas stations miles away. But for those who lived within, it was daily reality, one that offered no hope of escape. The bride, now wife and mother, had long ceased to dream of rescue. She was not waiting for a savior anymore. She was only enduring until the end. But endurance has its limits. As the years passed, neighbors began to notice her absence from town altogether. Some said she grew too frail to walk. Others whispered she had simply given up. The children appeared instead, sent on errands, their presence unsettling to those who saw them. They were living testaments to what had happened in that house, and each time they crossed the threshold into town, people looked away. It was easier not to meet their eyes. And here lies the heart of the horror, not just in the acts committed behind closed doors, but in the silence that allowed them to continue. Entire communities carried knowledge they refused to voice, fearing reprisal, fearing shame, fearing what it might mean to admit that such darkness had taken root in their soil. Silence became complicity, and complicity became tradition. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have spoken out, or would you too have kept your head down, pretending not to see what was happening in plain sight? The pale bride's story was not one of choice, nor of freedom. It was a story of inheritance, the inheritance of shame, the inheritance of silence, and the inheritance of a bloodline collapsing under the weight of its own secrets. By the time the pale bride reached her final years, she was no longer a bride, no longer even truly a wife or mother in the ordinary sense. She was a figure of pity and of dread, a woman who seemed more ghost than flesh, drifting silently through the narrow halls of her home. The years had carved hollows into her face, the sharpness of her bones standing out against skin that seemed to grow thinner with each season. She had become a mirror of her own children, carrying in her body the same marks of a lineage that had fed upon itself. Some say she died in childbirth, her body finally giving way after being pushed beyond all human limits. Others insist she lingered bedridden, wasting away in a house that no longer echoed with her voice. However she passed, one truth remained certain. Her death was quiet, unrecorded, unmarked by ceremony. No grave marker stands to bear her name. Like so many of her children, she was simply absorbed back into the soil, her memory fading into rumor. But death did not end her story, it sealed it. For what she left behind were not possessions or a legacy of love, but children who would continue to bear the deformities and scars of their blood. Each generation carried fragments of her suffering, fragments of her silence, fragments of a wedding that should never have been. In this way, her life did not end. It multiplied. Communities nearby spoke less and less of her as time moved forward, but the unease never disappeared. Travelers passing through the hills would sometimes remark on strange encounters, faces in the woods, voices carried on the wind, children whose appearance seemed unsettling, though no one could say exactly why. To the outsider, it was folklore. To those who knew better, it was memory refusing to die. And perhaps that is the true horror, not just the wedding itself, not just the shame of what was done to a girl barely old enough to live, but the persistence of it. The way silence turned one act of cruelty into a cycle that spanned decades. The way a single wedding became a curse etched into generations. Even now, her story clings to the hills like a shadow that refuses to lift, a reminder of what happens when families close their doors and turn inward, when silence is chosen over truth, when shame is allowed to wear the mask of tradition. What lingers most about the pale bride's story is not the spectacle of her wedding day, nor even the misery of her short life, but the weight of what it represents. A wedding that should have been filled with joy became instead a public sealing of a private curse. A girl of 13, dressed in white curtains, walking toward her own brother under the watchful eyes of a family that had already chosen her fate. It was not love. It was not union. It was ownership, the kind that leaves scars not only on bodies, but on entire generations. And here lies the haunting truth. Her story was never truly hers. It belonged to those who controlled her, those who stood silent, those who watched and did nothing. It belonged to the bloodline that demanded her obedience, the community that looked away, and the silence that has echoed across the decades since. Her name is lost, her voice erased, but her suffering has become legend, preserved not in sympathy, but in whispers that carry the weight of warning. In the end, the pale bride was less a person than a symbol of how shame can be passed like inheritance, how silence can become a weapon sharper than any blade, how bloodlines can devour themselves when truth is buried deep enough. The shame of her wedding was not hers to carry, and yet it consumed her life. The shame belonged to those who forced it, to those who allowed it, to those who still whisper of it today without daring to say it aloud. And maybe that is why the story endures. Not because we seek to mock the faces of the children born from that cursed union, not because we find fascination in deformity or horror in poverty, but because somewhere deep within us we recognize the danger of silence. We recognize the human capacity to look away when truth feels too heavy. A wedding of shame, a bride erased, a family bound to itself until it withered. This is not just the story of one girl lost in the hollows of America's forgotten hills. It is a reminder, buried in the soil, etched in the bones, that some unions should never be celebrated, some vows should never be spoken, and some secrets are too heavy for silence to keep forever.